Welcome back to New Day. A lot of breaking news this morning in the hunt for Flight 370. Another possible underwater signal in the area where 4 pings were picked up in the last week. This, as CNN learns, Malaysia says they scrambled jets the morning after the disappearance of the flight, and the flight's altitude dropped as it crossed the Malaysian peninsula. Also, sources close to the investigation tell CNN it now appears the last person to speak in the cockpit was the pilot, not the co-pilot, as was originally said by investigators, by Malaysian officials, actually. For more, let's bring in CNN senior international correspondent Nick Robertson in Kuala Lumpur. Nick, this is a lot of your reporting, and I want, of course, you to clarify all of the plane movements and what you're hearing from your sources.
Well, we know that 5 Malaysian Airlines pilots who were familiar with the pilot and with the co-pilot were played the audio recording of air traffic control with the cockpit, and they have said that they believe that the person who made the last radio communication, who said "Good night, Malaysian 370," was in fact the pilot. They also say there's no evidence of a third voice in the cockpit. They also say that it sounded calm, that there was nothing out of the ordinary, no distress. We know as well, after the plane took its left turn, flew back across the Malaysian peninsula, when it gets back out over the sea, it then disappears from military radar, reappears about 120 nautical miles north-northwest of that location where it disappears. According to the sources we're talking to, they say that maybe because it was dipping to fly under aircraft lines that are used for flights, regularly used for flights to Europe and to the Indian subcontinent. We also understand that Malaysian airline jets were scrambled as a, quote, precautionary measure about half an hour after the Air Force were told by Malaysian Airlines that the flight itself had gone missing. So a lot of new details here, but perhaps for investigators the most important one. 2 minutes before the transponders get switched off, the last radio communication from the cockpit is from the pilot. This is something they've been searching to find out. Kate?
Absolutely, Nick. A lot of information to work through. You'll continue to work your sources. Thank you so much for the update on your reporting. Let's bring in Michael Kay to discuss a lot of what we've been learning here from Nick Robertson. Michael, thank you so much for being here. Yes. So I want to start with, let's talk about this drop in altitude. It's something that has been a question really throughout the investigation. When I was over in Malaysia, there was an initial report from a local newspaper there, the New Straits Times, talking about a possible dip to 5,000 feet. It initially was kind of seen as that seems unlikely, but now we're hearing from Nick Robertson it may have dropped to 4,000 to 5,000 feet. What do you make of this?
Well, I've always been asking the question, Kate, on why the Malaysians couldn't or hadn't identified a blip on their radar as it crossed their country. Now, we know in the post-9/11 world order that aircraft cannot just willy-nilly enter sovereign territory without being interrogated. The 777, it's a wide-body jet. It's got a huge radar cross-section. That means it will show up on an air defense radar as a big blip. Now, if that big blip doesn't wear a squawk, so the transponder has that 4-digit code, that's what it's for. It's to identify it on a radar screen. So if you've got this big blip that doesn't have a squawk, that isn't flight planned, that isn't part of any routine airways traffic, this is a big red flag to any sovereign territory that has air defense jets ready to react to anything entering into their sovereign territory. So this has always been the question for me.
Let's talk about also the area that we're talking about here. Let's walk over to the map to take a closer look. One of the areas we're talking about is this is when it was cutting across Malaysia, going to the Malacca Straits, right?
Absolutely. So this is kind of the region here in the South China Sea where it disappeared. And then we know that it actually crossed Malaysia. And it actually did sort of this route, so it came to the north and then went northwest. So it avoided Thailand and then out into the Malacca Strait. Now the question's always been, how could a 777 cross an entire country without being seen on the country's radar and without the military reacting to it? That was a worrying question that hadn't been answered. So I think where we're at now is we've now got this additional information of it actually descended in altitude. And the question we've got to ask ourselves is, why did it descend in altitude?
The why is a huge question, of course. While we talk about the why, let's throw up the animation of the flight path once again, just to remind viewers of what we, of course, have been focusing on and has been the focus of this investigation, that turn you just pointed out right there. Michael. One of the reasons Nick Robertson's sources are telling him they believe the dip in altitude, his sources say, was to avoid the commercial traffic in the area, because that is a very busy commercial route.
Yeah, that's a completely feasible option. I mean, we were on the other day talking about the route that it took over the coast of Sumatra. Was it avoiding radar? And I think that's you know, the whole avoiding radar thing is very difficult. As I've mentioned before, primary radar goes out to about 120 to 150 miles. If you're in a wide-body jet and you're at 5,000 feet, you're going to have to go out well beyond 150 miles to avoid detection, possibly 400 or 500 miles. You're also going to have to descend down much below 5,000 feet. Mary Schiavo alluded to it earlier on. I mean, I spent my life in my previous job avoiding radar, avoid being detected by radar, because that's what gets you shot down. And we fly around at 100 feet. When I used to fly to avoid radar. So 5,000 feet to me is still very high. I think it's more likely something wanting to avoid the territory, wanting to avoid the airspace. Airspace goes out to about 12 nautical miles off the coast in any country. And then you're in international airspace or high seas and maritime waters. So for me, it's probably more about avoiding the land rather than avoiding radar specifically, because that is a really hard thing to try and judge.
And it's also difficult to understand as we're kind of talking about it up here. Dean, come back on in. Let's take a look at this closer one more time. One of the things we talked about last week was how it had come out very far around Indonesia, right? That was that big turn, because it was initially thought that to avoid radar, possibly avoid radar detection here.
This is Banda Aceh.
Right.
And Banda Aceh, there's a huge radar station.
And so that's why we saw the path seen as kind of going around this way. What we're now talking about, the new information from Nick Robertson, is we're talking about the left-hand turn right here in through the Malacca Straits, right before it came up here. Am I wrong?
Yeah, so it actually this is the South China Sea where it came. So it actually turned left, and then the actual track brought it down here. This is Thailand, and it avoided Thailand and then went northwest up to the Malacca Strait. Yeah, so it's taken an abnormal track. If you imagine that its flight plan was originally up to Beijing, which is this way, it's taken an unusual track. It's taken an unusual left, and then it's taken an unusual right. I mean, to me, that is evidence that it's avoiding Thailand airspace for whatever reason, and then it's proceeded out, avoided Sumatra, and then it's come around the top of Sumatra. This is all Indonesia here. And then it's headed south into the area where we're looking for the pings. So for me, as someone that's been involved in aviation, that's avoided radar and spent many years working about how radar works and learning about how radar works, that is a very distinctive track, which is completely away from the original flight plan and has involved a number of course changes, which are very odd.
And it's important to point out, it's all important information, but they're just pieces of a puzzle that, again, do not quite yet fit together. We're now beginning to understand more of what happened up here and down here where the pings are located. We are not, I wouldn't say we're any closer to yet understanding why. And that's, of course, where the investigation will lead us as we go forward, right?
I think it's a brilliant point. I mean, this is a jigsaw puzzle, and every little bit of information we get is just an extra piece, so we can stand back and we can hopefully see the bigger picture. There's kind of three phases to what's going on here. There's the where, the what, and the why. The where has taken 34 days or 35 days, and we're still trying to work it out. And hopefully, we're going to have enough information that will give us a resolution there soon. The what will be when we've sourced those black boxes and the relevant agencies can download the data, and then they'll know the flight path, the altitude, the speed.
No more guesses on that.
They'll know conversations. But that won't tell us the complete picture of the why. And I think the why bit, given all of this mysterious information, is going to take quite some time to discern.
Absolutely. And caution on our part not to jump to any conclusions.
Absolutely. We shouldn't be jumping to phase 3 when we haven't even found the where, which is phase 1. So we should leave that little bit in the middle. We should stick to the facts. As you say, keep building this picture, and hopefully, in time, the picture will become large enough and clear enough for us to be able to make some viable conclusions.
Absolutely. Michael, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Very helpful.
Good to see you.
Thank goodness we have such a big map. Chris.
All this information is certainly good for one thing. It allows us to continue to test what's coming out of the investigators, what makes sense, what doesn't, when have they been wrong, and what is the right information. So that's helping us. We're going to take a quick break here. When we come back, we will have more on the plane because there's new information, needs new understanding.